In 1991, former World Bank chief economist Lawrence Summers sent a memo to his colleagues with the subject line, "Dirty Industries. Just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the LDC, which stands for Lesser Developed Countries? You see," he argued, because wages are lower in certain countries, pollution would mean fewer losses in earnings due to illness or death. In other words, the economy would suffer less if poor people became ill or died. Further, he said many countries are underpolluted, not absorbing their fair share of global pollution. Lastly, he said a demand for a clean environment depended on income. Poor people would simply rather have development than a clean environment. When the memo leaked to environmental groups and outrage obviously ensued, Summers explained that it was a sarcastic response to a colleague's proposal. But whether it was really sarcasm or not, it accurately describes the logic of outsourcing under capitalism, and sadly, the market logic behind his statements also informs many of today's conservation and green development policies too. Carbon offsets and the global trade in solid waste, for example, allow for the production of waste and pollution in one place to be absorbed by another via global exchange. One place can maintain the status quo of overproduction and overconsumption, while others who have contributed very little to the ecological crisis can shoulder the burden of global conservation or live and work in the debris of our cannibalizing economic system. Despite the clear damage being wrought by this system, many politicians, NGOs, corporations, and international governing bodies continue to promote capitalist solutions for the problems created by global capitalism itself. In the current debates around how to stave off the impending sixth mass extinction, those arguing for an embrace of capitalism and for nature to be managed by humans not for its own sake, but insofar as it can be useful to humans via capitalist development, are the new conservationists. New conservationists think we need to do away with wilderness spaces and instead manage all of nature as a rambunctious garden, with nature being conserved for the purpose of advancing capitalist accumulation. Neoprotectionists, on the other hand, are calling for a back-to-the-barriers approach, with many prominent biologists arguing we need to conserve half of the Earth or more via protected areas or other area-based conservation measures, strictly enforcing boundaries between humans and nature. You heard me, half of the Earth. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a multilateral treaty that 196 countries have signed onto, meets every 2 years to set targets for biodiversity conservation. In 2010, parties agreed on the Aichi targets, which stipulated that by 2020 the world would have conserved 17% of all lands and inland waters and 10% of marine and coastal areas. Although we met the 17% target globally, many nations did not meet the target, and the quality of these protected areas and the protection they offer is questionable as biodiversity decline increased between 2010 and 2019. Despite this, negotiations are ongoing now to pin down a 2030 target, with many parties forming a high ambition coalition to push for 30% or 30 by 30. Although the US is one of only a couple states not party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, big surprise there, Biden announced a 30 by 30 plan at the start of this year that is ruffling some feathers. Republicans are up in arms, calling it a federal land grab and arguing that private property rights need to be protected. And on the other hand, indigenous nations and their allies are rightfully concerned about tribal sovereignty and about how conservation will proceed and by whom. And we're talking about 30% here, so these concerns would clearly be magnified at 50%. In this complete quagmire of conflicting interests, ideologies, and action plans, our collective future hangs in the balance. To unpack all of this and find a way to move forward, we're going to look today at the history of Western conservation, both market-based and protectionist, and ultimately what both approaches get so hopelessly wrong. It is me, though, so never fear, we will be ending on a positive note, I promise. To start, we need to clearly name the main driver of our ecological crisis. As most graphs on climate change look like this, the Industrial Revolution and the transition from feudalism to capitalism is a good place to start. You've probably heard this popular joke going around that capitalism is a system that maximizes individual freedom and prosperity. Good one, right? No, it's a class-based system based on private property. This means that the means of production are owned privately by capitalists, and workers, having been stripped of their means of subsistence, have to sell their labor power for a wage to survive. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, the enclosure laws in England privatized huge swaths of communal areas and forests, stripping independent smallholders and peasants of any land and any means to make what they needed to survive. Without this, they were left desperate and destitute and were forced into wage work, often in the polluted cities of the Industrial Revolution where they were severely exploited, working 14 hours per day, 6 days per week. Even children were exploited in this way. This process of enclosure and subsequent proletarianization, or forcing people into wage work, is called primitive accumulation. Once a class of workers has been produced in this way, in order for capitalists to make a profit, they are incentivized to keep labor costs and costs of resources as low as possible. They want workers to produce as much as possible for the least amount of money, so that they can take as much of the surplus value as possible for themselves. When workers transform raw materials into commodities or otherwise provide services, and those things sell, the capitalist pays the worker only a fraction of what the commodities or services are worth, and keeps the rest for themselves minus the overhead costs. Wanting to keep a downward pressure on labor to stay competitive and increase profits, many capitalists will oppose unionization efforts, will outsource their production, or will automate to lower the cost of labor. And they will cut corners environmentally to lower the cost of resources, using the cheapest and most polluting fuels, using the most unsustainable extraction processes, dumping waste cheaply or illegally, you name it. As Pete, Robbins, and Watts state,
competition in markets makes short-run economic survival so difficult to secure that long-term care of the environment becomes a utopian luxury. Under market conditions, any individual capitalist has to produce commodities at prices regulated by inter-capitalist competition. This forces even the environmentally, socially concerned capitalist to produce at the lowest cost, regardless of the external consequences.
Importantly, market prices do not represent social and environmental costs or long-term consequences at all. I'm going to let the story of stuff discuss what it means that environmental costs are externalized in capitalist production.
The goal here is to keep the prices down, keep the people buying, and keep the inventory moving. How do they keep the prices down? Well, they don't pay the store workers very much, and they skimp on health insurance every time they can. It's all about externalizing the costs. What that means is that the real costs of making stuff aren't captured in the price. In other words, we aren't paying for the stuff we buy. I was thinking about this the other day. I was walking to work and I wanted to listen to the news, so I popped into a Radio Shack to buy a radio. I found this cute little green radio for $4.99. I was standing there in line to buy this thing, and I was thinking, how could $4.99 possibly capture the cost of making this radio and getting it into my hands? The metal was probably mined in South Africa. The petroleum was probably drilled in Iraq. The plastics were probably produced in China, and maybe the whole thing was assembled by some 15-year-old in a maquiladora in Mexico. $4.99 wouldn't even pay the rent for the shelf space it occupied until I came along, let alone part of the staff guy's salary who helped me pick it out, or the multiple ocean cruises and truck rides pieces of this radio went on. That's how I realized I didn't pay for the radio. So who did pay? Well, these people paid with the loss of their natural resource space. These people paid with the loss of their clean air, with increasing asthma and cancer rates. Kids in the Congo paid with their future. 30% of the kids in part of the Congo have dropped out of school to mine coltan, a metal we need for our cheap and disposable electronics. These people even paid by having to cover their own health insurance. All along this system, people pitched in so I could get this radio for $4.99. And none of these contributions are recorded in any accounts book. That's what I mean by the company owners externalize the true costs of production.
While the video is a bit dated now, it's still a fantastic resource, and it explains another facet of capitalism's relationship with the environment: planned obsolescence. In order to maintain profits and economic growth, it would be against companies' interests to sell you things that last and don't need to be periodically replaced. So they purposefully sell you things that will only have a certain shelf life, or with parts that need to be replaced each year. This is why we see things like new chargers needed for each new phone update, so that you need to keep buying more stuff. Further, under capitalism, things are produced for their exchange value rather than their use value. It would clearly be more useful to make universal chargers that never needed to be replaced, but commodities are produced for exchange here. Whatever is most profitable will be done regardless of the environmental or social costs. Neoliberalization, as an extension of capitalist logics into all spheres of life, helped provide capitalism with spatial and temporal fixes for the two main contradictions of capitalism. That was a mouthful, so let me explain. The first contradiction of capitalism is that any given market will eventually become saturated. Either people will no longer need what you're selling, or in an effort to keep labor costs low, capitalists will have kept wages too low for people to afford what you're selling. The result is stagnation. The second contradiction of capitalism is that through the production process, capitalism destroys what it needs for its own reproduction, the environment and laborers. If resources are degraded and depleted, it hinders production and accumulation. Now, neoliberalism is commonly understood to have begun in the 1970s and 1980s with Reaganomics and the policies of Margaret Thatcher. The process is associated with privatizing state services, cutting social spending, and liberalizing trade barriers, leading to an increase in outsourcing, where corporations take advantage of lower wages and more relaxed environmental laws globally to increase their profit share. In this way, neoliberalization allows capitalism to get around its contradictions for a while by opening up new markets and resources, and through financialization, creating fictitious commodities that can keep accumulation going. Now, if workers anywhere get together and unionize and demand better, capitalists can just move production elsewhere or attempt to automate. This predictably led to a global race to the bottom in terms of wages, working conditions, and environmental health, but created windfall profits for the wealthy capitalist class. And none of this happened without violence. Actually, Western imperialism since the Second World War was always about securing resources and opening up new markets for capitalist accumulation, with the US, Canada, and other allies overthrowing over 50 democratically elected governments and supporting countless brutal dictators in the name of imperial plunder. In doing all of this, the Pentagon became the world's biggest polluter. Our Changing Climate has a fantastic video on imperialism and the climate, which goes further into this, but anti-imperialist action is pivotal in our fight for a livable future. Recently, the United Nations Environment Program suggested that we need to decouple environmental destruction from economic growth, assuming that specifically capitalist economic growth is needed to quote-unquote develop undeveloped areas. Aside from the fact that uneven economic development is a feature of global capitalism, which always produces poverty alongside wealth, there is no evidence that absolute decoupling is possible. Understanding our political economic system, we can see clearly that it is not. Our economy relies on inflows of resources and energy and returns outflows of waste and emissions. There are obviously limits to the amount of inputs we can put into the system, and also limits to the amount of waste and energy that can be stored, absorbed, and recycled on Earth. Plus, whenever we recycle, we are essentially downcycling, with some energy and matter inevitably lost or degraded. As Fletcher and Ramelt point out,
perpetual financial growth within the confines of absolute biophysical limits is theoretically only possible if efficiencies in the throughput keep perpetually rising faster than the rate of growth. This implies that there should be no maximum eco-efficiency limit.
This is, of course, absurd. I hope it's clear that this is patently absurd. But if we try to internalize the environmental and social costs that are externalized under capitalism, the prices of goods would rise. Patel suggests that the average fast food hamburger would cost $200 if all social and environmental costs were included in the price. This would make things so expensive that most conventional markets would cease to function. Capitalists would need to pay workers far more than they earn, which would further decrease profits and hinder economic growth. The only dematerialization we can really think about would be growth in the finance sector, but this is hardly a long-term sustainable growth strategy. So if you take anything away from this section, besides anger or frustration, please let it be that capitalism cannot be the answer to its own ecological contradictions. Write that down, or just keep it in mind for later. If global capitalism is what is currently destroying our planet, colonialism is where it all started. Colonialism and capitalism are inseparable. Colonizer countries stole land, resources, and people from colonized nations in order to obtain raw materials for production, to obtain cheap labor or slave labor to produce raw materials, and to open up new markets for their goods, often destroying local economies in the process. Like in England, this involved enclosing and privatizing land and resources and forcing millions into low-wage work or slavery, or simply corralling them onto reserves and restricting their livelihood options immensely. Settler colonialism, like what happened in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and more recently Israel, centers around the theft of land, violently dispossessing indigenous peoples and disrupting their relationships with the land to set the stage for capitalist accumulation and long-term settlement. In settler colonialism, land is remade into property, and human relationships to land are restricted to the relationship of the owner to his property. We're going to focus on settler colonialism today as it relates to the national park model that is most prevalent around the world, which originated in the US and was exported around the globe. Very importantly, settler colonialism is not merely an event, something bounded in time that happened a long time ago, but that we've now moved past. Colonialism is an ongoing structure of dispossession that continues to alienate indigenous people from their lands and waters for capitalist gain. As Glenn Coulthard puts it, it is territorial acquisition in perpetuity. This has and continues to be done through a variety of coercive mechanisms, including treaty negotiations, direct military invasion, the manipulation of famine, the abduction of children for residential schooling, and the criminalization of indigenous resistance. Sadly, parks and protected areas have been and continue to be a major mechanism of colonial land theft. Indigenous peoples across all colonies, settler or otherwise, have been alienated and often violently removed from the territories they once managed sustainably in the name of conservation. The earliest parks in the US, Yosemite and Yellowstone, drew boundaries around territories managed by indigenous peoples, violently evicted them, and restricted park access to those who had the money to pay for leisure and nature tourism experiences. The earliest park in Canada, Banff National Park, was created after the discovery of hot springs in the area, which the Canadian Pacific Railway Corporation wanted to capitalize on. The Stoney Nakoda Nation were evicted from their territory, and their Aboriginal and treaty rights were violated when they were banned from practicing traditional livelihoods in the park, something that was guaranteed to them. If you go to Banff today, you'll find big global polluters, Lululemon, the Keg, Louis Vuitton, but no indigenous people living on the land or managing the territory. In the name of conservation? This Yellowstone model, also called the Fortress Conservation model, was then exported globally, with evictions and the militarization of conservation increasing across Africa, Asia, and South America. In South Africa, they even brought in white military personnel from other Commonwealth countries to train local rangers to shoot to kill poachers, who are often marginalized people who have been dispossessed from parks. There's much more to say on this subject that we won't have time for today, but in sum, jeep safaris and hotels? Yes. Indigenous livelihoods and land management? No. To understand this anomaly, we have to understand what historian William Cronin calls the wilderness ethic in his chapter The Trouble with Wilderness. In it, he describes how Western societies understand wilderness and how we should conserve it. Although forest ecosystems clearly exist materially, the way we understand nature and our relation to it is socially constructed. It varies over time and varies between different social classes and different cultures. Cronin traces the shifting ways in which American society invested wilderness with meaning throughout the 18th to 20th centuries. American society's understanding of wilderness went from a deserted, rough, and terrifying place to a sublime landscape that brings one closer to God, to a symbol of the disappearing American frontier and the masculinism and rugged individualism it represents, and finally to a more civilized, leisure-based destination for the upper middle class. All of these understandings, though, see wilderness as something outside of and separate from humans and human society. It is a place to avoid, a place to conquer, a place to visit, but not a home, not deeply integrated with human civilization. Imagining wilderness as people-free, pristine, and untouched does violence to indigenous peoples who have lived in and shaped these ecosystems for millennia. It legitimated their expulsion from protected areas in the name of conservation, or the strict restriction of their livelihood activities within parks. In the egregious expulsion of the Kasiku-Wenat Ojibwe from their small reserve in Riding Mountain National Park, wardens burned their homes and barns to the ground as they were marched out. So traumatic were the events surrounding the eviction from the park, the chief Norman Bone described the incident as our mini version of the Trail of Tears. For close to 60 years, an indigenous presence was erased from the park, as it has been erased from many parks. But most so-called wilderness areas have never been people-free. They were actively maintained by indigenous peoples through various legal and knowledge systems. The Amazon rainforest itself is a product of 8,000 years of indigenous agriculture, leading some researchers and historians to suggest that we should think of it more as a garden. We're already seeing the effects of suppressing indigenous fire practices in protected areas as well, with wildfires raging across the US, Canada, and Australia in areas where indigenous fire management was banned. And managing nature as disconnected islands free of human activity has failed to stave off catastrophic biodiversity loss, as animal ranges are truncated by highly developed areas, as many parks are located adjacent to extractive industries, and as capitalist accumulation outside of protected areas has accelerated climate change. Importantly, this fortress style of conservation also transformed non-capitalist relationships with nature into capitalist ones. Wilderness in North America was socially and spatially produced largely for commercial tourism, emptying lands within the earliest parks of indigenous peoples and instead welcoming in well-off settlers who would pay top dollar for a unique, sanitized wilderness experience. Nature's externalization here legitimizes its commodification. If nature is separate and outside of us, then it can be quantified and sold. Quote-unquote wilderness is now only accessible to us as a place of leisure and tourism. It is something out there, far away from us. We can pay to visit it, even via highly consumptive commercial tours, but heaven forbid anyone collect medicine or carry out a subsistence hunt. To be transparent, I'm someone who adores national and provincial park tourism, hiking, camping, and just generally being in forests whenever I can. It does benefit one's physical and mental health, and it is true that within a capitalist political economy, intact ecosystems need protection from the rapaciousness of profit-driven extractive industry and real estate development. But the Western-centric wilderness ethic is rife with contradiction, and it can implicitly frame commercial tourism and capitalist lifestyles as more compatible with conservation than land-based livelihoods based on reciprocity with nature. While we may not immediately see the environmental cost of dining at the Keg or buying products from Lululemon, painting this as more conservation-friendly than indigenous livelihoods is dangerous and irresponsible. Further, Cronin argues that by imagining wilderness as other and as outside, locked away in parks far away from where we live, we give ourselves permission to evade responsibility for the lives we actually lead. Framing conservation as something that happens out there obfuscates the ways in which we contribute to environmental degradation in towns and cities. Cronin concludes that an environmentalism that does not see humans as an integral part of nature and the ecosystems of which we form part is doomed to failure. This is clear because if we imagine that humans have no place in nature and that human activity can only degrade nature, we don't actually know how to live. This can lead to Malthusian or some strands of deep ecological thought that see humans writ large as a cancer on the earth, and that humans need to die for nature to live. This ignores that not all humans have destructive relationships with nature, and that the destructive logics and forces of capitalism don't need to structure how we live in the world. In Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, she compares the creation stories of Eve and Sky Woman as a way to discuss differences in worldviews and how these shape environmental relationships. Sky Woman descended to Earth while pregnant, bringing with her a bundle of things to plant, as a good guest would. The plants and animals all helped her down and collaboratively formed Turtle Island, with Sky Woman's bundle helping to provide for the plants and animals in return. This is a story of deep reciprocity and interconnection with the relations that sustain us. Eve, on the other hand, was banished for tasting the fruit of a garden, instructed to subdue the wilderness in order to eat. While these stories can be written off as folklore, the discourses that form our worldviews have material consequences. One story has real potential for imagining our social and ecological futures. The other has led to some pretty misogynist thought, first of all, and to a society that sees nature as a resource to be subdued, separate from and beneath us. It resonates with the discourses that undergird the fortress style of conservation so prevalent today. Thanks to this model, park people conflict has characterized much of the early global conservation movement, entrenching poverty and leading to human rights abuses, including murder and sexual assault. As capitalism raged on outside of protected areas, changing the climate, polluting the air, water, and soils, Fortress-style protected areas, as disconnected islands of refuge, have not, as we know, been able to stave off biodiversity decline. Understanding capitalism's relationship with the environment and the false nature-culture binary imposed by Western conservation and thinking, this is unsurprising. So why are the proposals for saving the planet still centered around market-based solutions or strict fortress-style protection of large swaths of the Earth? With growing critiques of the fortress model of conservation, we saw a shift in conservation practice around the 1980s, which we'll recall is around the onset of global neoliberalism. The 80s and 90s were characterized by rollback neoliberalism, where government agencies were cutting budgets for conservation and other public services, and market-based models of conservation funding and governance were becoming popular means of offsetting the loss of state spending in protected areas. The neoliberalization of conservation is a huge topic that we are only going to touch upon today. I may go further into all of this in another video, but to simplify things, neoliberal conservation helps capitalism get around its second contradiction by turning what would be the negative externalities of capitalism into new opportunities for investment, accumulation, and growth. It is characterized by the increasing commodification, marketization, and financialization of ecosystems and their services, and the devolution of governing authority to non-state actors, including private companies and bingos, or big transnational NGOs, most of which get their funding from big polluters like Shell, ExxonMobil, and Bayer. Moving away from fortress-style interventions that used force or the threat of force to make local communities comply with regulations on their livelihoods, neoliberal interventions set up incentive and disincentive structures to encourage local actors to become homo economicus, or the ideal self-interested entrepreneurial actors, and choose what are considered conservation-friendly livelihoods, for example ecotourism or managing land to receive payments for ecosystem services. Aside from the fact that global tourism is far from conservation-friendly, the majority of these interventions end up increasing inequality as they disenfranchise poorer farmers and favor elite families with larger landholdings. In instances where communal land is broken up into private landholdings, people often end up needing to sell their land to outside investors or better-positioned elites. These types of livelihood-based interventions often fail to conserve biodiversity as they can't compete with other more lucrative land uses, and they don't address the main drivers of deforestation or other environmental degradation like industrial harvesting. The result is new rounds of primitive accumulation and mixed at best environmental results. Other kinds of interventions, like offsets and biodiversity banking, try to use markets to make up for the quote-unquote unavoidable harm done by development by having corporations invest in the conservation of an area of land in a different geographical area into the future. Making two areas of land equivalent and exchangeable requires the technocratic reduction of the holistic value of ecosystems into quantifiable ecosystem metrics, which are abstract numerical scores that can be traded using money as the medium. These calculations are often crude and grossly reductionist, and the species living in the area to be destroyed certainly won't benefit from the conservation of another area far away. But importantly, the idea of equivalence is based on the idea that if we didn't conserve this other piece of land far away that is already intact, it too would be destroyed. So not destroying it makes up for the fact that we've destroyed an apparently exchangeable ecosystem somewhere else. We started with two intact ecosystems, and now we only have one, but that's offsetting? The logic is astounding. There are a number of other issues here too. Take the REDD+ program, for example, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. Through this program, polluting countries or companies can purchase carbon offsets from places where forests are being protected. Again, there are problems with calculation here and ensuring that CO2 emitted in one place is actually being equivalently absorbed elsewhere. And again, if we aren't talking about adding trees here, just maintaining the ones that we have, this would only ever, at best, maintain the status quo. But perhaps more importantly, there are serious problems with land rights, leading many indigenous peoples globally to resist this kind of green neocolonialism that prohibits forest-dwelling communities from practicing their livelihoods in their homelands, livelihoods that have not contributed significantly to causing the climate crisis, so that they can shoulder the burden of conserving their territories untouched, so that the people and companies who are destroying the planet can continue to do so. In cases where indigenous people don't have clear tenure rights, the program can incentivize governments to claim ownership of the land, or the private company who bought the rights to carbon there can claim de facto ownership and control of the area. This can and has led, once again, to the displacement of people, usually from the global south, so that overproduction and overconsumption in the global north can continue. And all the while, our biodiversity keeps declining. Further, conservation has become a new frontier for financial investment, and non-human natures are being rescripted in terms of banking and finance. New investment funds, bonds, and derivative contracts are changing the relationship between financiers, governments, and environmental policy. Governments have issued index-linked carbon bonds that allow investors to hedge against the risk of governments not meeting their carbon reduction targets. Nature derivatives allow governments to issue derivative contracts that sell species extinction risk to investors. The argument is that this will make species survival more valuable, and thus habitat protection will gain importance. If the population of the species in question declines lower than the agreed-upon threshold, the principle that the investors paid would be used for rehabilitation efforts for the species. But, Sean Sullivan remarks,
"It seems perverse to transform the value of species survival into a price whose rise or fall is entangled with bets on their susceptibility to irreversible loss, underscored by a calculus whereby species value rises with rarity or greater risk of extinction."
McAfee calls neoliberal interventions like bioprospecting and ecotourism selling nature to save it, where nature earns its own right to survive in the global marketplace. When it comes to nature banking, Sullivan says it's not only selling nature to save it, it is also the putative saving of nature to trade it. The central use value of ecosystems becomes their ability to garner exchange value under new conditions of created scarcity. We don't have time to delve into it fully today, but spectacle and fantasy are key to sustaining neoliberal conservation schemes in order to paper over the clear contradictions involved with the twin neoliberal fantasies of consumption without consequence and accumulation without end. Ultimately, we know that capitalism can't be the solution to its own ecological contradictions. Making conservation hinge on whether or not it is profitable to do so within a global capitalist system that is predicated on environmental destruction to fuel perpetual growth is probably not the way to go, guys. I just don't know what else to tell you. While some of these mechanisms can be useful in the interim, nothing short of a revolution of the political economy of conservation and society as a whole will do. Happily, though, we have options. Given that conventional approaches to conservation, both protectionist and market-based, have dispossessed indigenous peoples from their territories while largely failing to stave off severe biodiversity decline, scholars in political ecology are increasingly calling for a conservation revolution. Büscher and Fletcher term this revolution convivial conservation, which is a vision, a politics, and a set of governance principles that proposes a post-capitalist approach to conservation that promotes radical equity, structural transformation, and environmental justice. This revolution requires transcending the separation between humans and non-human nature imposed by conventional protected areas, and moving beyond conservation politics that are premised on and reproduce capitalist relations of production, consumption, and accumulation. Büscher and Fletcher recognize the necessity for decolonial conservation and acknowledge that their vision for alternative sustainabilities is not wholly new, pointing to indigenous-led initiatives that have long embodied conviviality. As we've shown, colonialism and capitalism are inseparable phenomena, and the roots of the Anthropocene crisis arguably trace back to European colonialism and indigenous dispossession. Addressing the roots of this crisis, indigenous-led conservation therefore represents a decolonial alternative to conventional state, non-governmental, and private-led approaches to protected areas, and, as Bernauer and Roth put it, helps maintain the conditions of possibility for a future decolonial and anti-capitalist social transformation. This is a global phenomenon, but where I'm from, so-called Canada or Turtle Island, where indigenous peoples have been stewarding their territories for millennia, there has been a recent surge in indigenous governments and nations declaring indigenous protected and conserved areas, or IPCAs. Globally, these are often referred to as ICCAs, Indigenous Community and Conserved Areas, or country in Australia and New Zealand, so there are many names for Indigenous-led conservation initiatives. These spaces are declarations of sovereignty and commitments to manage their territories for future generations in accordance with their legal and knowledge systems. While conventional conservation is rooted in a worldview that delineates a separation of humans and nature, IPCAs are managed in accordance with indigenous laws, which are usually informed by or founded on natural law, which is a term that refers to worldviews in which humans have responsibilities to uphold reciprocal relationships with other species and play a vital role in the functioning of healthy ecosystems. While Western notions of wilderness leave no room in nature for humans to exist, IPCAs model alternative sustainabilities, the lessons from which can be translated beyond their borders to transform how we think about and practice conservation more broadly. Bernauer and Roth argue that IPCAs and other forms of indigenous-led conservation are places where we can reclaim our collective responsibilities towards the land, pilot economies rooted in indigenous values, and model appropriate collaborative relationships that can provide for a post-capitalist future. The Indigenous Circle of Experts report, We Rise Together, discusses the productive potential of indigenous economies and legal traditions to inform alternative development models within and outside of IPCAs.
Since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples in Canada have been diligent and ingenious cultivators of biological diversity through advanced economic practices that were founded on natural law. Indigenous economies followed indigenous worldviews, which understand that human systems are part of, and must remain in balance with, ecosystems. The outcome and effect of these worldviews and economic practices was abundant, thriving biological diversity.
The visions for many IPCAs include the creation of indigenous conservation economies, which combine cultural and subsistence economies with initiatives such as ecological restoration projects, sustainable harvesting of plants and animals, indigenous guardians programs, and community tourism, with the goal of enhancing community self-sufficiency and self-determination. Most IPCAs also have a plan and vision that looks 7 generations into the future. The reciprocal integration of human and non-human societies in IPCAs thus offers a powerful vision for the future of conservation, as well as for the development of alternative economies that address the root causes of climate change and biodiversity loss, colonial capitalist dispossession, and growth. We know that Indigenous managed lands are critical for biodiversity conservation, with Indigenous peoples protecting 80% of global biodiversity. We also know that Indigenous land and water protectors fighting the colonial and capitalist takeover of their territories have reduced emissions in the US and Canada by 25%. And yet, Indigenous nations are largely left out of international meetings, like COP26 currently going on in Glasgow. These sovereign nations don't have seats at the negotiating table. What's more, Indigenous land and water protectors are being murdered around the world, and their resistance is increasingly criminalized, with states using militarized force to protect colonial and capitalist interests. And most Indigenous governance regimes are not formally recognized, and in Canada in particular, but also elsewhere, IPCAs are under constant pressure and threat from extractive industry. Grassy Narrows First Nation in Ontario, for example, had their river system poisoned with mercury since the 1960s, and the provincial and federal governments have been criminally negligent in cleaning it up. Surviving this, the nation successfully stopped clear-cut logging in their territory after holding Canada's longest Indigenous-led blockade, which started in 2002 and is ongoing. They then declared their territory an Indigenous sovereignty and protected area to ensure no further logging or mining would occur, so they could focus on remediation and building a conservation economy centered around subsistence activities and restoration, with sustainable harvesting and community tourism to furnish the rest of their livelihood needs. But after all of this, the province has recently allowed for a rush of gold mining claims in the territory, which would once again threaten their rights and livelihoods and any conservation potential of their IPCA. Respecting Indigenous jurisdiction and laws, including international law like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples with its principle of free, prior, and informed consent, is critical to advancing a new paradigm of conservation. While IPCAs still need to exist within the capitalist framework at the moment, many assert alternatives to settler capitalist hegemony. Importantly, though, Indigenous-led conservation initiatives would be limited in their ability to challenge extractivism and settler capitalism on their own. And so, as Büscher and Fletcher note, the conservation revolution must be part of a much broader movement for total human and non-human liberation from the interconnected systems of oppression undergirding the global biodiversity crisis, including colonialism and white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, among others. In the short term, that can look like solidarity activism with land and water protectors and the land back movement more broadly, militant activism blocking fossil fuel projects, making use of the legal system to whatever extent possible, general strikes, supporting degrowth activism, implementing solar punk solutions, and in the longer term, building dual power, wresting power away from corporations and capitalist governments, and living new social relations of production and consumption into being. We know that simply putting aside large swaths of land without a broader transformative shift in worldview and how we are living materially will not address the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. We also know that capitalist solutions to capitalist problems are futile. The time was yesterday to act on this, but knowing what we know now, we have options. Thank you for watching, everyone. Thank you to the Lick Crit Guy, St. Andrewism, Professor Flowers, and Silver Spook for lending their voices. Please check out their channels. I have links below. Thank you to Dave Jacobs for the incredible animations, and thank you to Tristan for help editing the video. Thank you also to my incredible patrons who make my work possible. This kind of work will likely never be sponsored, so if you'd like to support the continuation of these videos, please find me on Patreon, or you can give me a one-time donation via PayPal. The link is in the description box below.